Welcome back to the first session of today's forum, the title of which is Feminist-Humanitarian Reframing of Global Security Activism. And we're so honored again to have Dr. Rebecca Johnson, founding co-chair, ICAN, and 2017 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. She's going to adorn us with her speech on the title, after which we will have a little break. And then I will invite the discussants and introduce them to all of you. So, and Dr. Johnson is going to start now.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Wasn't that a wonderful photo? Well, I'm looking forward to seeing it. I've had the privilege of giving 3 full days of lectures and discussions with a number of you, but I know that there are some new ones here. So I would just like really to start by thanking Professor LEUNG and Lingnan University and the Global University. And now that we're opening the 6th South-South Forum on Sustainability, to thank the entire team that has enabled this to come together, who have kindly invited me to participate and to engage on these lectures. Now, the main thrust of the lectures I was asked to give were really, sorry, I need my water next to me, sorry, because my throat gets very dry. Is to, was actually on nuclear, sort of going literally from nuclear 101, the kind of, basic nuclear technologies that apply to both weapons and power generation, through to each, in successive lectures, more detail on how civil society is engaging on these and the treaties, the whole arms control, non-proliferation, and then disarmament thrust. And then on up to a wonderful final session that we held, in which we invited participants who were here from other struggles, other communities. We had from Japan, from Fukushima. We had from Brazil, from the People's Assembly and the landless workers, and from Venezuela, and 3 or 4 representative talks on different community and regeneration and ecology projects in mainland China, as well as, of course, from Hong Kong, that really showed the breadth and the depth of the different kinds of civil society organizing that is possible and in fact is being done. And this is the subject of my keynote, is on tackling climate and nuclear emergencies and the feminist-humanitarian reframing and global security activism. I wanted to start by a film that I saw that you, I think, can get from the web too. And it's a strange, but very, the film stuck in my mind a lot. It was called The Age of Stupid. And in this film, which was by an activist filmmaker called Franny Armstrong, the elderly white keeper of the world's archive, which was somehow in a tall building above an inundated, partially drowned world. And he's reflecting in 2055, this shocked me already, that it's not so many years away, 30 years hence, 35 years hence, on how humanity ignored all the warning signs and how we drove ourselves into extinction. And he's looking at news clips from the archives and interviews from one year, 2008, as arrogant politicians and complacent industrialists keep pursuing the gods of perpetual growth and business as usual. As extreme weather conditions, typhoons, desertification, wildfires out of control, all these that we are already now becoming more familiar with, really extreme weather conditions and famine decimate vulnerable countries, and in the end, everyone, and create migrations of starving, displaced climate refugees that we are already beginning to see, and create war, more wars, and the use of nuclear weapons finish things off in this film. Not many of the clips that he was finding and using showed women or speakers from the global south, which is of course significant, isn't it? Not only because of where the filmmakers were coming from, but because the global south and women have for so long been written out of the histories, and indigenous communities so long pushed to the edges, marginalized, victimized, and not treated as and not recognized as agencies of the solutions and the change that we need. The nuclear and climate dangers we face together have their roots in the structures and rapacious attitudes that have long underpinned patriarchal policies and attitudes, intersecting with coercive religiosity. And by that, I do not mean the faiths and belief systems that so many of us have in many, many different ways, right across the world. What I'm talking about here, the coercive religiosity, I'm talking about the power structures and the oppressive, exclusive institutions that seek to control our lives, control and divide and derive power from certain belief systems in the world. And colonialism and slavery in their past and their present forms, accompanied by domestic and sexual violence, especially against women and children, and recognizing that present forms of slavery are very much around things like the trafficking of women and vulnerable communities, often from indigenous or vulnerable or indeed people who have suffered from wars in their own regions and countries, being exploited by people with more money, more power. And this is how these work. The capitalist drivers of climate destruction and military-industrial drivers of political power, profit, and war are mutually dependent and inextricably linked with the production, development, and use of nuclear and all inhumane weapons, and also, of course, with climate destruction. Across all known human cultures, economic, social, and military activities are gendered. Generally, the assumptions and structures of gender intersect with othering, the imposition of division and power relations based on race, class, ethnicity, relative wealth and resources. Of linked relevance is the age capability nexus, where biological years and education and physical and intellectual abilities can intersect with either privilege or the ways that disempower individuals and groups, depending on societal and cultural assumptions and hierarchies. And in these, we recognize that they can be working both ways. The young, perhaps the under 20s, and the old, the over 60s, in some but not all our cultures, very often end up least likely to be heard and listened to and respected. But some cultures also particularly place the young at the center, or they place the elderly. So it doesn't work. One size doesn't fit all. It doesn't work the same way in all, but this is an intersection of the capabilities and all of these other elements. The purpose of this lecture, however, is not to rehash theories about gendered violence or capitalism and militarism, but to consider how feminist and humanitarian analyses, more recent analyses, and actions are reframing the zone of viable strategies to tackle extinction level security problems. And to do this, I'm going to focus on 3 campaigns that I've been personally involved with. Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, which opposed the cruise missiles, the most, the newest system in the 1980s of medium range, so-called theater nuclear weapons that we saw as being about fighting a nuclear war with Europe as the theater. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and its role in achieving the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the third one is the very recent non-violent disruptions that have coalesced under the name Extinction Rebellion, XR, in the UK, but it seems to already be beginning to spread around the world, demanding urgent recognition of the climate emergency that threatens all life on Earth. Now, my personal engagement with these 3 campaigns provides me with very direct, on-the-ground experience with which to analyze aspects that outside researchers may not notice or recognize from their own theoretical and experiential standpoints. But of course, on the negative side of that, I recognize this means that my analyses are infused with my own origins and experiences as a white British woman, scientist and campaigner. That doesn't mean that what I say is wrong, but these limitations are important for us all to recognize in what I'm saying. And this is why I hope that we will be able to critique these from many different standpoints. Climate destruction and nuclear weapons have already and will continue to disproportionately harm the most vulnerable people and species who share this earth. Though active in their own communities, billions in the global south remain unheard by northern-dominated media and decision makers. That means that people like me, who are privileged to speak, must use our voices responsibly and create greater opportunities for others, especially people who are vulnerable and disadvantaged, to speak and act more safely and to be heard. As learned when I marched for women's rights back in the 1970s, the personal is political, and we have to all speak truth to power. Nearly 50 years later, as I join a new generation of Extinction Rebels to warn about the climate and environmental emergencies we face, the banners are proclaiming explicitly, tell the truth, act now, and rebel for life. Or we could put the emphasis slightly different, rebel for life. My nickname as a teenager, because my first name was is Rebecca, my second name is Eleanor, which is my mother's name. I had the nickname Rebel right back in my teenage years. And now I see a generation of young people on the streets of London with Rebel for life and sending emails to each other saying, "Dear rebels." So things happen like this. So before looking at the cross-cutting lessons and future challenges, it is useful for me just here to provide a rather brief synopsis of these three campaigns. And I am doing that a little bit with just some photographs, but I'm not going to speak directly on the photographs. Here I'm mostly going to be using the text that I provided for the keynote, adding to it a little bit, but because I wrote that for the length of the lecture to correspond, and I know the interpreters and translators have this too. But I think you will recognize some of these pictures. Also, those of you that saw the lecture that I the series of lectures will recognize a few of these, especially when I come to talk about ICAN. This, of course, is actually the kusono the camphor trees, what's the other word? The Australia has them, the eucalyptus trees that I also saw yesterday when I was taken to visit a 600-year-old shrine here in Greater Hong Kong. Was the same kind of tree outside this. This was 2 eucalyptus trees outside a shrine in Nagasaki after the bombing. I just explained that, but I think most of these I'm not going to explain. They don't really need it. So the first one is the Greenham Common, halting the US-Soviet nuclear arms race in the 1980s. The early 1980s were one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, with 50,000, actually it was over 50,000 nuclear warheads poised and ready for someone to make a mistake, and several thousand more in storage. In 1979, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, decided to deploy a new generation of medium-range land-based nuclear missiles in 5 European countries, starting with Greenham, about 60 miles west of London. These were two types, the cruise missiles and the Pershing, and they were being deployed ostensibly in response to the deployment of also medium-range ground-based weapons, the SS-20s, on the Soviet side. Under the banner Women for Life on Earth, a group of 20 to 30 women and children, and a handful of men, in fact, walked for 10 days from Wales, arriving at the US Air Force Base, Greenham Common, on the 5th of September 1981. Their demand was very modest, just a televised debate with someone. They wanted the Minister for Defence, the Secretary for Defence, but someone from the British government and or NATO about the decision to deploy these cruise missiles in Britain and this so-called dual track and zero option. But the women were ignored. So they chained themselves to the main gates of the US base, evoking the suffragette sisters who were our grandmothers, the campaigns for women to be able to vote from earlier in the 20th century. And then when it started raining, because of course this was England, local people brought tents and food. And then over days and months and then years, the peace camp was established. Nobody made a decision. It was kind of organic, becoming an inspiration for peace women around the world. This is not the place to describe the many forms of creative, disruptive, non-violent actions we used, which ranged from dancing on the nuclear weapons silos, lying down to block the extension of the base, many of the being arrested for lying down under webs of woven wool and then singing on top of great big rocks that the military and the authorities dumped on the peace camp that the first women had started. This is 1982. You might actually recognize this is me under the web and then being arrested, because the personal is political, isn't it? I had never been arrested before. I never thought, as I was growing up, that I would ever be arrested and break the law for my beliefs. But these nuclear weapons, it felt like we all had to do something. And of course, I was just a student at that time at the University of London, and I didn't have any power. Nobody was going to listen to me. I was just an ordinary person, and this was the only way that so many of us, and during the first year, the camp became women only, partly because the men there were only a handful of men, but they kept telling the women what to do. And then when it was time to do the cooking and the washing up, they weren't around. They just wanted to do the talking to the media for the women. So it was necessary, and for other reasons too, which you can read about in some of the sources I provided. So it became a feminist, non-violent peace camp in the first few months. And during that year, and actually after this period of time when we were evicted from where we were, but we just kept coming back, and we were not allowed tents, so we just lived under plastic. We were arrested. A group of us, and with some women's peace groups that were beginning to develop in other parts of the UK, we decided to invite as many women as possible to come to us to the base, embrace the base on Sunday, and close the base on Monday. That was our message. And then we used this symbolism of the spider web. So on several occasions, and we had these messages of share the world. And this was what happened on that Embrace the Base, which happened actually December 12th of 1982. And in fact, I was released from prison just 2 weeks with 18 others, just 2 weeks before this. And they put the microphones in my face and our faces and asked us how we felt, and they wanted to open champagne. We said, this isn't about champagne. If we can spend 14 days in prison to prevent the breach of the peace of these weapons, because this was the law they used. It is a law from the year 1362. It is over 600 years old, this law that they use. I think they had a very similar law here in Hong Kong. And we said, if we can go to prison for 14 days for trying to keep the peace, we were not breaching, we were keeping the peace. You can come to Greenham and spend 1 day, and if possible 2 days, embrace the base on Sunday, close the base on Monday. And over 35,000 women came. And it was snowing the beginning of the day. It was cold. And they brought their families, and they brought amazing things, messages, banners, children's clothing or toys that their children had grown up or that the children asked to put on the fence, symbols of our fears and our hopes. And this is what we'd asked. And on New Year's Day, after this happened, and thousands became suddenly involved, and they went home and they set up groups, and it spread and it spread. This was New Year's Day, and we found a way to go into the base and climb on top of the nuclear weapons bunkers, silos we called them. And I was one of these women. This was the close the base. We blockaded. Look how many thousands of women. And that is a US military bus trying to get into the base. And it is marooned in a sea of women. And here again, this is a younger version of me in front of the bulldozers that they were trying to use with again, some of my friends. So these are just some pictures of this. So on several occasions, we blockaded all the gates. We occupied the air traffic control tower. We disrupted the nuclear exercises. This is an example when they would take the weapons out. We pulled the military fences down. With bolt cutters, we snipped holes in the rows of fencing and used these as doors and windows to enter the most sensitive parts of the nuclear base. And also, we said, to free the military so that they could see the world outside of their American military nuclear assumptions. We occupied and then drove US Air Force buses and painted cluster bombs, planes and cruise missile launchers with symbolic blood and peace messages that disrupted and delayed their use. On one occasion, 3 of us got into hangar where cruise missiles were being actually loaded onto a transporter erector launcher. This was the name given to this kind of vehicle, transporter erector launcher. And I managed to climb into the cab while my friends were distracting them of this launcher, and I locked myself in while my companions distracted the soldiers. We didn't know if the missiles were armed with warheads or empty. But after a standoff of a half hour or so, I gave myself up, as I was concerned that the armed and frantic servicemen who had rifles on their backs would harm my companions. When these launchers and their convoys of military guards and police vans went onto public roads to so-called melt into the countryside, as the military planners phrased these nuclear exercises all along the route, they were monitored, marked with pink porridge mixed with paint. Very difficult to get off, especially if the sun has shone on it, and frequently stopped and boarded by Greenham women and local cruise watch citizens, because from that then we involved all the communities of people who lived in those areas along the roadsides that were used. And there are some really amazing stories associated with those. Thousands of evictions, arrests, and imprisonments could not kill our spirit and determination to stop the nuclear madness. Singing songs of resistance and empowerment, we kept going at Greenham and other bases until Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev saw sense and discussed nuclear disarmament in Reykjavik in 1986. In December of 1987, they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty, which banned all ground-based medium-range nuclear weapons from Europe, from East and Western Europe. This was groundbreaking, this treaty. And this is actually the treaty that President Trump, and after him now, President Putin, President Trump suspended this treaty at the beginning of this year. And of course, as you would expect, a few weeks later, President Putin did the same thing. And this treaty could now be dead this important treaty, the first actual disarmament treaty, albeit regional, could be dead by the end of this summer. Greenham was a highly visible, Greenham was a highly visible element in the complex mixture of politics, pressure and protest that brought about the INF Treaty. And in fact, President Gorbachev later spoke in London about the importance of the work of Greenham women and the European peace movement. Scientists and doctors had published studies of nuclear winter that helped to convince US and Soviet leaders that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Millions across Europe and Japan were demanding nuclear disarmament, while US citizens coalesced around calls for a nuclear freeze on the US and Soviet arsenals as a first step to end their deadly arms race. At the sharp edge of government efforts to crush peace movements, hundreds of Greenham women were imprisoned, and the camps were persistently evicted, sometimes multiple times per day. We could barely get the fire going and put a kettle on for a cup of tea, and you know how important cups of tea are to us, before the bailiffs and the police would come round again. Despite, or perhaps because of the conditions we faced, Greenham protests grew into an unusual creative crucible that challenged and changed prevailing expectations of peace activism and sexual politics. As Greenham inspired and involved more and more women from around the world, we made links to oppose the racism, colonialism, and sexual violence that blighted the lives of indigenous people who were so often at the forefront of suffering the militarism and production, testing, and practices of nuclear and other inhumane weapons. And I talked a lot about those in some of my earlier lectures, which looked more in detail at where nuclear weapons were tested, where the uranium mining, where the different nuclear kinds of nuclear explosions were conducted around the world. As a feminist movement that did not want to have or depend on leaders or stars to represent us, Greenham women insisted on the rights and responsibilities that we all have, individually and collectively, and that we must exercise. That was the symbolism of those spider webs that we painted, that we wove, that we put onto our posters. Mutually reliant connectivity and shared power. Each strand you can think of was each of us, very fragile. Each of us is just one human being, very fragile, but connect us together. My goodness, we can be strong and powerful. So powerful that, as that poster showed, we caught the nuclear weapon in the spider's web. We stopped it so that it could not be used and exploded. And this, of course, was some years before the World Wide Web that everybody now knows of from computers. The initial motivation for walking to Greenham was to halt the US-Soviet nuclear arms race, starting with that new generation of crews, Pershing and SS-20s. The Women's Peace Camp, at least during the first decade of effective Greenham Women Are Everywhere campaigning, was about, of course, very much more, living and learning about all aspects of patriarchal power and militarism. Greenham women challenged ourselves and everything else, from received theories of power to patriarchal developments of non-violence as passive resistance and civil disobedience. We learned from those, but we didn't just parrot them, we changed them to apply more effectively to the lived experience of us as women. And yet these things kept going, didn't they? This nuclear testing, whether underground now by some countries, there were still accidents, like, that looked like it was a mushroom cloud because in fact it was accident that was much bigger. And of course, all these missiles. In fact, in many ways, the nuclear arms race has been mostly a nuclear missiles race. Of course, we had to keep pushing for disarmament through civil society activism and diplomacy. And our Green and Women Everywhere found its way into so many different countries and into so much different thinking. And these are just some of, like Women in Black, which started in Jerusalem, opposing the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian lands. This is where I was first tear-gassed, was joining in those occupations against the apartheid wall there, but also got taken up by women in the former Yugoslavia as those countries broke apart into nationalistic wars, and women from parts of the Yugoslavia, from Serbia, from Croatia, from Bosnia, from Kosovo, they became part of a wider network with Women in Black that now is across Africa and Asia. The recent meetings have been in Colombia and Bangalore in India, and Cape Town was the last one. And we got finally this comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty that I talked about a lot in my earlier lectures. So you can see that when they are uploaded. And yet here, these kept on. This is the Trident nuclear missile system. I photographed most of these things with my own eyes. This is also participant activism. I participated in this CTBTO verification exercise in Kazakhstan, where we actually were testing for radioactivity from the testing program. But everyone, we had to wear these protective clothes, but we were also testing the verification system of on-site inspections for this comprehensive test ban treaty that has still sadly not entered into force because of the rivalry among nuclear-armed countries. And I took this from actually my living room of the flat I lived in for two years when we organized Faslane 365, which was another civil society engagement, but in Scotland, a whole team of us, like your team, we got together, we collectively organized. And this is actually UK nuclear warheads being transported between England and Scotland by road. This all continued. We had the INF Treaty, but we had not stopped nuclear weapons. We had not stopped militarism, and jobs were used as a domestic excuse for more nuclear modernization. But there are more jobs, as well as a lot more security in banning nuclear weapons. And so we kept being reminded by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. This is the bomb dome of Hiroshima. Many will recognize this. They kept reminding us that we have to ban and eliminate all nuclear weapons, not just a medium-range group of weapons in East and West Europe, but all. We had to ban and eliminate all nuclear weapons around the world. And we did this through mass demonstrations. We did this. This is the Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp. Peace camps kept going. But this one, because of the plutonium contamination around, this is the major nuclear bomb factory in the UK. Our peace camps were only ever 2 days, once a month. But this shows the new laser that was built in order to modernize the nuclear warheads for Trident and, in a sense, get round the disarmament purpose of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So they weren't going to do the underground actual nuclear tests, but they wanted to do it inside the laboratories, inside the labs. I like this one because it was also my birthday. The first nuclear test, as those of you who heard my first lecture, was done by the UK on my birthday in 1952. And dragons, and I know dragons are very powerful, symbolic for you in China, for the Chinese participants here, and very much for the Welsh too, and my grandmother was Welsh. And this is a Welsh Blockade, and you can actually see me sitting there with my laptop open, doing the press release in the middle of this blockade. So, and even some members of my family came, my cousins, and professionals and doctors and musicians and artists, all protesting at the different nuclear bases. And this was an amazing one when Hibakusha and their children and grandchildren came together from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they also blockaded this gate that you can't see is actually the gate to the Faslane nuclear submarine base. And they sat and they sang Japanese peace songs. And indeed, some were arrested. I think 5 or 6 of them were in the end. So we realized we needed to ban nuclear weapons completely. And during that period of time of sort of 2006, 2007 was Faslane 365. In 2007, a project of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War came up with the idea and the name ICAN and used this logo of the broken missile over the peace symbol. So linked with the movement of this symbol, which was this campaign for nuclear disarmament from the 1950s in Britain, but it means peace, broke the weapon over that, which was a famous poster from 1983. They used that. And then I began to strategize, really having listened while I lived in Scotland to all the groups. There were so many community groups from villages in Scotland, Wales, England, and groups of professionals, the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the professors, the students who came up, and they were all talking not about the detail of, the bombs in terms of the technicalities and the yield. They were all talking about the humanitarian impacts and consequences. And this is when we developed the strategy. So it was the group in Australia that founded ICAN as a project, and then me and Peace Boat and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, who then, with their agreement, brought it and set it up, established ICAN in Geneva with an office in the Geneva is, of course, where the UN does most of its disarmament negotiations and talks. And we revisited, and our scientists, this is Alan Robock, revisited nuclear winter studies for the 21st century. And so this was how ICAN was founded. From the very beginnings, it was founded by, feminists and doctors and humanitarian disarmament campaigners. And so this treaty was the culmination, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was the culmination of years of campaigning in which nuclear weapons were reframed as a collective humanitarian problem that requires prohibition and elimination rather than a national military defense asset that needs to be limited, that needs only to be maybe controlled or limited and managed, but not illimited. So the humanitarian change of the discourse was actually, this is not a weapon that can be managed. It is a weapon that must be abolished. And while nuclear states and most of NATO chose to boycott these meetings and negotiations going right back, we launched at the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty meeting of 2010, and then Oslo, and then Nayarit in Mexico, then Vienna, the governments of these countries, Norway, Mexico, then Austria took the lead in holding conferences, and I went into much more detail in my study. And but these in the process of all of this, we educated the governments, or we reminded the governments, and we definitely were educating members of parliament, especially from global south countries, that nuclear weapons are not an issue that is just for the nuclear armed states to do. It is a human security issue, and therefore they, as members of the UN General Assembly, that the countries that had made their continents, Latin America and Africa, and most of the southern hemisphere, right across the Pacific, most of the southern hemisphere, into nuclear weapon-free zones. These were the countries that had done the right thing. And these were the countries that have to take the lead. We did not have to wait, because we would wait until the world was dead. We would wait until nuclear war extinguished most of the planet if we were just going to wait for the countries that have nuclear weapons because they have vested interests in the power, the status, even the theories of deterrence that are saying that these weapons are necessary for their security, but oh no, the rest of you don't need nuclear weapons for deterrence. And so gradually, as ICAN developed more internationally, we had campaigners, established groups, even in places like Israel, where the government, the Israeli people are not even allowed to say that they have nuclear weapons. They can only say according to outside sources. Our Israeli campaigner had a radio program based in East Jerusalem that was actually called According to Outside Sources, so that she could talk about the nuclear weapons. And the young people also, as we see increasingly, the young people. So I was invited, of course, and some key people in ICAN to be delegates to the first conference in Oslo. The young people were outside, and they had messages. And what were they saying? Thank you to all the governments that came, because a lot of governments boycotted. But not all the nuclear armed states. India and Pakistan came to those meetings. And the next meeting in Mexico, there were even more. In Oslo, there were, I didn't say how many. In Oslo, there were about 127. By Mexico, there were 146 states. And of course, the Red Cross was very involved. And so we were going out. This meeting was in Tunisia to raise awareness among Arab states. Our African delegate, one of our African members of the steering group, Lynette, from the Religions for Peace African affiliate, which is all over all the countries of Africa, right from south to north, speaking in the UN for civil society. This is a meeting in Latin America, a round table, we called it. And so indeed it was a round table, organized by CELAC, our ICAN steering group partners from Latin America, with their parliamentarians, their government officials. It was all, civil society reaching out and talking about how these countries had to come to the UN and demand that there would be negotiations. And then the UN General Assembly, through the resolution process, they got, they said, and I love this picture because it shows an Iranian doctor and a Costa Rican doctor, both from this organization, well, from ICAN as well by this time, and them also speaking themselves directly to the delegates at the Nayarit conference on behalf of their newly formed youth group, Amplify, which had come out of an earlier and combined with called BANG, which was the Ban Generation. And so taking the environment, the humanitarian process was really, really vital for, for what ICAN did. And unlike the non-proliferation and arms control lobbies, ICAN spent our first decade focusing our priority campaigning towards civil society, parliamentarians, and governments in the non-nuclear nations, most of which were in the global south. Our aim was to demonstrate that nuclear disarmament was not just a prerogative of the nuclear haves. The nations without nuclear weapons have essential security interests, rights, and responsibilities to protect their populations from nuclear annihilation. And in protecting their populations. The first business of government is to protect your own population. But of course, it is all interdependent. So if we could persuade them of their right and responsibility to ban nuclear weapons to protect their own people, and that was what was so important that came out of the nuclear winter studies and the nuclear famine studies that we showed, then relate that to education, then they also would be protecting the whole earth. So it went then to Vienna, 157 governments there, and actually this time including the US and the UK, and China also attended and sent emergency planning people there because it was about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And out of that, Austria couldn't get consensus for statements, so they gave a summary, but they then took the Austrian pledge. And this time they called on all NPT states to identify and pursue effective measures to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. And they called on the NPT states at that time because in 2015 there was the next NPT review conference, and we already were being accused, ICAN and some of the non-nuclear governments were being accused of undermining non-proliferation by calling for a nuclear ban. And we said, no, we are not undermining. We want to fully implement and reinforce nuclear non-proliferation. That's why this Geneva, and this clock may be significant to you, it stopped because of the atomic bomb. So we took this to the UN ourselves, and in 2016, the UN General Assembly itself agreed to hold negotiations in 2017. And this is how they described it: a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading to their total elimination. And this is actually a group of us who were there at the UN at this time when Peace Boat came with, and I think this is also very interesting, on board were Japanese and Korean hibakusha. People often forget that there were Koreans in both Nagasaki and Hiroshima as forced labor at that time. And so just before those negotiations took place in 2017, we got a lot of people together. This is an ICAN meeting the day before. And in fact, you will see the only Green Party MP we have in the UK, because she was the only MP at that point who came over to join a demonstration, a women's demonstration for nuclear abolition and peace. That's actually her chief of staff. Next to her, that's a key campaigner from Scotland next to them. And then there's a group, and it was just a picture of some of the people. There were a lot more. And after months of negotiations, as I'm sure you all know now, on 7th of July 2017, the UN adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this was Hibakusha Setsuko Thurlow speaking then and speaking again at the Nobel ceremony on 10th of December. And that just shows you our team, and a diverse team from all the continents, just a group of 10 in the steering group, and then the staff members. So this is civil society contributions to peace, justice, human rights. And then finally, I'm just going to introduce a little bit about XR and the rebelling against extinction, the climate action. And these pictures, again, just took a few. My role was as a legal observer, so I didn't take very many photographs, but here are just a few that show some of this messaging. This is actually Big Ben, but they're doing work on it, but it's right in front of the British Parliament. We blocked the whole of Parliament Square. We blocked the whole of the shopping complex of Oxford Street and Oxford Circus. It was very symbolic. The choices were very symbolic. This is looking down towards Piccadilly, completely blocking the big rich where all the jewelry stores and the clothing stores where people spend thousands and thousands, only the rich people spend thousands on a handbag or an article of clothing that nobody else can afford, that is made by workers in so many different countries who are paid a pittance, a tiny wage. And the police, and these just show some of the ways. This is a writer called Jay who draped herself she was one of the last, because she'd locked on, they had to bring cutting equipment to separate her from the other woman, and they couldn't just lift them because they would break their arms. So they had to so it took hours. And I was the only person allowed. There's a big police cordon with all the other people behind it, but I was allowed there because I had to talk to the police and to them. And this is the kind of van that the peaceful protesters were put into to be taken to the police station. This is Waterloo Bridge. It looks like a garden. Mm-hmm. And again, blocking that because it's one of the main traffic, cars being a major, all these cars, thousands, millions of cars, the fossil fuel that was thought in the 20th century to be a liberation for travel, and all of this is killing our planet. So this was symbolic because they blocked it completely. And you can see children, and they've planted things, and they've got little tents, and they say, act now for climate change. And this is, the theatre complex, which a lot of people would recognize as being on the south bank of Waterloo Bridge, so people could see this, know that we had blocked Waterloo Bridge with all kinds of things. And this was such a message, this wake-up message. So this is just sort of how you can see, and my talk gives more detail about the principles. Now, Extinction Rebellion was a different kind of example. I told you about Greenham was not really planned at all. It was kind of organic. Then ICAN was very much planned, organized. It was a non-governmental organization that was established. From being a project, it became a non-governmental organization. We had, co-founders, co-presidents. I was one of them, Akira Kawasaki from Peaceboat and Tilman Ruff from Australia. We were the first founding co-presidents. It had all these establishment kind of things, and it had a clear strategy, and it implemented with governments this very clear strategy. We knew exactly the steps we wanted to take, and we found ways to take them. Extinction Rebellion was a bit between the two. The group that first planned for 2 years. They studied movements around the world. They tried to work out what works, what doesn't work. They brought in people who understand media messaging, and they came up with these slogans like "Wake Up," and "Rebel for Life" or "Rebel for Life," and "Act Now," and "Climate Emergency." They had that, but once they sent out the messaging within the UK to begin with about coming together in a very decentralized way. It was almost word of mouth, and it was by Twitter, and it was by WhatsApp, and it was by social media. And a lot of us almost missed the very first one they held. They only expected 100 people, 200. They got a couple thousand. And then this time, we by word of mouth, we knew the locations that people from our part of the country should go to. And they, by this time, were encouraging XR in lots of different countries. And they said they actually took place in 70 different cities around the world. And they acknowledged the leadership of the very young people like Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist who took days off school to sit in front of her parliament, and who inspired a generation of school children to do the same, to come out of school. Because what can be more important than preventing the climate that is going to destroy their future? And if they want children, destroy that future for future generations. So this was so powerful. So it was all about, tackling the accelerating climate catastrophe, reducing and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, changing our profligate, polluting use of resources, preventing further loss of species that share the earth with humanity, and developing a regenerative culture that promotes care, mutual, loving responsibility, healthy living, resilience, and adaptability. And so now I'm going to think about, so since then, I should just say XR has spread from the Solomon Islands to Australia, from Spain to South Africa, from the US to India, according to the XR website. And now I want to look at the characteristics that connect these three campaigns, but also to think about it, and that's really the purpose of this, with the help of those who will also provide commentaries, to think about what this is telling us about our future of protest and the ways in which these feminist and humanitarian thought processes are mobilizing, are changing how we think about all of these issues. So Wake Up is my first kind of subheading, because and I decided just to choose just some of the slogans, because XR, they said that they had studied what slogans would wake people up, and because they are so new, I thought maybe they will have some resonance. But we can also critique these things. That is part of our purpose here. So it's this wake up. The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. I think this is so important. This is why Greta Thunberg, why the students, why, because we are conditioned to believe the older people, the politicians, the governments, the officials, somehow all of those that are paid to deal with these issues, someone else is going to make the difference. And have they? No, they're continuing with fossil fuels. Even when the UN gets together to study climate, they do their best. But they're talking about 2%, 1.5 to 2%. And that's already going to inundate low-lying. It's going to inundate most of the low-lying islands of the Pacific, of the Atlantic, most of our low-lying areas where there are deltas like Bangladesh or in Brazil, or, the whole Thames area for Britain's capital city. All of these areas are coastlines. Where are the nuclear power plants being put? In that, we talked about this a lot in our lectures, right on the coastlines. What happened in Fukushima? The inundation of a nuclear power plant by a tsunami that they had not expected to be so big. So wake up. We are the ones who have to change the world wherever we are and whoever we are, by linking with each other. That's the wake-up call. Okay. So it's a wake-up message about the dangers, but it's also a wake-up message about political responsibility. Don't sleepwalk off the cliff. This is the notion of it. And framing nuclear war and climate destruction as existential threats. All of those three, Greenham, ICAN, and XR, are warning, wake up before it's too late, and then take action. So this urgency is what impelled me to give up at that time. I didn't mean to give up. I didn't want to give up my study. I never wanted to get arrested. I never wanted to have to go to prison. Nobody wants that. But it seemed like a nuclear emergency in the 1980s, that nuclear war would happen if we didn't wake up and wake the leaders up. And how could we do it? Only with ourselves and our voices and our bodies. And this is really it. And we drew from history and experience. And so this is my analysis of change. Some kinds of policy of change can be achieved through incremental, linear steps, but most can't. Success depends on identifying the change you want and the challenges you face, and applying the appropriate strategy to get you where you want to be, or as close as possible. If change can be achieved piece by piece, step by step, then it may be useful to try to do it like that. But if there's a deep chasm to cross, incremental steps will lead you to downfall, because if you can't jump across it, you fall into the chasm. So you have to calculate what acceleration you'd need for a running leap, and if you actually, even with acceleration, can make it in one leap. And I use this analogy, which I won't now because time is running short, of the massive boulder. It was an analogy I used a lot during Greenham days when I spoke to people. So we have to really think about that. I'll move next to the act now, climate action now. So what do campaigners mean when they say act now? Actions aren't useful if they are just a reaction to crisis or a response to feeling we have to do something. This is panic, and a lot of times our governments, that's exactly how our governments act. But it actually often, they're not useful, it's often very short term. Often they end up blaming someone else, another country. You know, Trump does this all the time. Instead of tackling nuclear weapons as the problem, he tries to attack Iran. Or, you know, this is the way, you know, something has to be done, or we have to be seen to do something. There's a short-termism. So when we say act now, effective actions have to bring us actually closer to our objectives. They have to be the product of analysis by us, whether to achieve behavioral or legislative change, usually both, legal treaties, political agreements, cultural transformations, awareness raising so that others will act, like ICAN had to mobilize, or some other purpose. And effective actions need to be consistent with our principles and objectives. Violence provides a way of silencing and eliminating, or trying to eliminate, opposition. But it seldom, if ever, is effective for constructive, sustainable change. In general, violence begets violence, as offensive and defensive actions and reactions spiral into militarism, you know, missile defense, a case in point, terror, arms racing, and war. Conflict, by contrast, is not the main problem. It's not conflict that is the problem, because actually we often need to recognize conflict in order to overthrow oppressive regimes. So it's not conflict, though attempts are often made by the people with status quo interests to prevent, manage, suppress, and silence conflict. Conflict is a component and a driver of change, just as risk can be a component and driver of opportunities to make change and become more secure. And our three examples really show how that works. So like conflict, power is generally associated with violence and the tools of violence. We have to act safely and non-violently by exercising choice and communicating with the agents of authority. To be truly non-violent, we have to be powerful and empowered. And that's because patriarchy's version of power are attributive power, coercive power, and power over, including nature. Feminists, by contrast, conceive of power as power of, integrative power, the power to connect and to do, the web metaphor, used at Greenham and evoked more recently by XR. So moving along more quickly into some of these issues, beyond politics, we resist, it's one of the slogans of XR, we resist nuclear and climate extinction. To do so are profoundly political acts. But what XR is conveying in this slogan, beyond politics, is generally taken to mean that they are beyond party politics, that narrow definition, that divisive often, the mess that the UK is in is a mess driven by party politics, and this kind of thing. XR talks about setting its mission on what is necessary and emphasizes the importance of autonomy and decentralization, like Greenham. And like Greenham, XR's structure is likened to a web rather than the hierarchical structure or pyramid that is also a little bit part of ICAN's NGO sort of structure. We organize in small groups, say XR. These groups are connected in a complex web that is constantly evolving as we grow and learn. We are working to build a movement that is participatory, decentralized, and inclusive. So questions of power structures, decision-making, and control need to be addressed. And the examples I chose for this lecture address them in different kinds of ways. And regenerative culture. Now, this has become a bit of a buzzword among academics, but it is actually real, and it's important to think about it. And I hope that our commentators are going to take this a little bit further forward. I'm not first and foremost an academic. I'm an analyst and an activist. But it's being foregrounded by XR, and I think it offers a way forward for a lot of our movements. It calls on activists to openly challenge ourselves and our own toxic systems, whether they are through our own countries and nationalism, to leave our comfort zones, whoever we are, whatever our class, whatever our color, whatever our status in societies and age and capabilities, to leave our comfort zones to take action for change. XR highlights the importance of creating a regenerative culture which is healthy, resilient, and adaptable. And it emphasizes the value of reflecting and learning, which is exactly what Lingnan University has provided here, and the 6th South-South Forum on Sustainability and the Global University actually do in action, in practice. And like Greenham, XR seeks to welcome everyone and every part of everyone, with our sexualities, where we are on the gender spectrum, where we are on the class, where we are on capabilities, where we are on all of the richness of who we are in our families, in our homes, in our countries, and in the world. This is part of this. Greenham seeks, like XR, like Greenham, XR seeks to welcome everyone and every part of everyone. We refuse to be divided by others' prejudices or by the imposition of our own. By working actively to create safer and more accessible spaces and breaking down hierarchies of power for more equitable participation. As this banner says, because we are all interdependent, we have no planet B. We all of us have to save and build a different kind of planet A, our beautiful planet Earth. And we have to know and understand and believe that non-violent power does work. That is that missile silo that you saw us women dancing on top of when they were building it for nuclear weapons, and now it has horses and dogs and things because it got given back to the people of that area as common land, as it had been for generations. And this planet, this beautiful blue-green jewel, we have to keep on. We can't get a treaty or get a climate agreement or anything and think that's the job done. No, we will have to keep on working for the rest of our lives and for our children's lives. They will need to work to protect our shared home, prevent ecocide, support all life on Earth, build peace, justice, human rights, democracy and humanitarian law for all of us. And now I will leave my part and hear from everyone else. Thank you so much.